Yeah, and this is, I think, contentious among in our public to this day because, again, I don't think that people are aware of just how dramatic the UFO phenomenon had become, the flying saucers had become by 1952. And, I was just talking with you before we began recording about the story of the Canadian researcher Wilbert Smith. And Smith was very well known to American researchers. He was a Canadian government official, an extremely intelligent man who was deeply involved in communicating with the Americans all through the 50s on the UFO phenomenon. And at the end of his life, in 1962, he was dying. He was visited by a couple of researchers who were asking him things, and he let out that he had held in his hand a piece of a crashed or a piece of a flying saucer. And they were incredulous. He said, yes, absolutely. And he told them that it had been a part of an object that was shot down over Washington in 1952. They said, well, what happened to that piece? He said, well, I had to give it back. Where did it go? The CIA? He said, much higher than that. They continued to ask, and he said, look, you're going to have to look into this yourselves, gentlemen. And that was really all he said. Shortly after that, he died. So that's Wilbert
Right.
Smith's account. That's pretty much in line with a lot of the research you've been doing, isn't it?
Yes. Well, one of the main things here that caught my eye was an International News Service article, Richard, and it was on the 29th of July, 52, and the headlines read, Air Force orders jet pilots to shoot down flying saucers if they refuse to land.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm going to quote this for your listeners. The jet pilots are and have been under orders to investigate unidentified objects and to shoot them down if they can't talk them down.
Right.
So there was a lot of stuff going on. There were scrambles basically every day. And, we could talk about the Cold War involvement, and you could probably do a week-long lecture on that, the tie-in of how the country was frantic, expecting the Soviet Union to attack. And so they were basically scrambling out after anything and everything.
There was a lot of concern, without a doubt. The U.S. military, the intelligence community. I don't think anyone was actually thinking, oh, well, this is the Russians with some unknown technology. But they were concerned, at least some of them were concerned, that the confusion that could result over all of these reports of flying saucers in 1952 could jam communications so much so that if there were an actual Soviet initiative of some sort, that the Americans wouldn't be able to respond because of all of this. So there was that concern. But then there always, in my view, had to be concern by the Americans over these flying saucers themselves. I mean, it's not simply being worried, oh, they're going to confuse us if the Russians do something. I mean, these objects themselves were a great concern, and our jet pilots chased after them and were lost at times chasing after them. And I know that in your research, you found cases of this, and in fact, you looked into one in great detail, and I hope that we're able to talk about that.
All right, Richard, an interesting point here with the missing fighter pilots and all the research I did tied me into an incident that happened down here off the coast of Florida, just west of MacDill Air Force Base. It was an F-94 Starfire jet that vanished into thin air right before it all hit the fan and went north up the Flatwoods.
So what date are we talking about here, Frank?
This was September 12th, 52.
Yeah,
it was
the
actually
same
day, just about an hour and 20 minutes before everything went down up in the mid-Atlantic. This happened down in Florida.
Yeah, this is quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, same date, almost the same time. We have a very interesting mystery that you're about to describe. Go on.
Well, we have and I spent years researching this case, and it was actually more mysterious, Richard, than the Flatwoods case itself, because Flatwoods was well known. This case was long and forgotten years ago. Well, I actually found out about it from a News Journal article here in Daytona Beach.
Mm-hmm.
I was scouring through and I was looking up the September 12th incidents, and it was actually it was a couple days later by the time I hit the AP wires, but they did talk about the UFOs that we're seeing up over the Mid-Atlantic area, and the Daytona paper carried it. And as I was skimming through the microfilm, I found a incident where an F-94 Starfire from Tyndall Air Force Base, which is in Panama City, actually vanished into thin air. And that really caught my attention. And I started going full bore onto this case. And I was given the run around by all the different Air Force bases. I mean, I lost track how many I contacted. But long story short, Richard, at the time I wrote my first book, which was published in 2004, there was nothing on planet Earth that had any record of the pilot or his radar operator.
So that not only did the pilot disappear, but all records seemed to disappear.
Everything.
Well, that's interesting.
There was no Social Security death index, nothing. They were never in the Air Force. I had written the Air Force twice. They had no record of the incident. And I called Kirtland Air Force Base, and I wasn't greeted too courteously by the fellow I spoke to about the case, to put it mildly.
Uh-huh.
But honest to God, he said to me, "How did you find out about this case?"
Wow.
I said, "I found it in a newspaper article. And Richard, what God is my witness, I'm not kidding you." He said, "You mean to tell me that you have a newspaper from 1952? When I said September 12th, 52 to this fella I was talking to, it was like saying December 7th, 1941.
Wow.
His interest just peaked. And then he started talking to me about how it's expensive it's going to be to do research with the Air Force and blah, blah, woof, woof, all this kind of junk. And I just ended it right there. And I didn't pursue it any further. Then I contacted Maxwell with Kirtland. Then I contacted Maxwell Air Force Base, sent them a couple letters. They had no records of this incident
Even
whatsoever.
though it was reported in the newspaper, that's what got you started on this.
Right. And then I contacted other newspapers throughout the state of Florida, and they were all interested in this, and they were working with me pretty close on it. And I'm getting, I got about a dozen different articles about this case. And what I did is I put all the information together. I worked with a couple military guys, and we did a timeline from what was reported in the press conferences. And once I put this timeline together, it didn't make sense. There was too much missing.
Now you're saying the timeline of the F-94's mission?
Yeah, the mission and what was said, what happened. You know,
Right.
it was just a mess. It was an absolute cover-up from the get-go, and I knew that right off the bat. From there, I contacted the surviving brothers of John Anderson Jones Jr., who was the F-94 pilot, and John Del Curto, whose brother was in Oregon. And I contacted the brothers, and interestingly, the pilot's brother only lives about 25 minutes away from me here in Florida, where I live in Daytona area.
Okay.
Another
Right.
coincidence. And he actually contacted me back a couple days later, Richard, and he says, "Frank, I was digging around up in the attic, and I have the Air Defense Command Western Union, and I have the government documents, the letters that were written to me."
How about
my
that?
brother disappeared. Yeah, Richard, I almost keeled over. He sent me copies of them, and at that point I said, "Do you know there's no record of your brother being born, never dying? There's nothing. There's no Air Force records." And he got kind of upset over it.
Sure.
He was teased off. And then he sent me everything, and I went through all the articles, the press release articles from the spokesman at MacDill and Tyndall, where the flight originated from. Then I combined it with all the Western Union telegrams. And the Tyndall, there was a Tyndall document from the big wig up there. So anyways, I put all of this together and I form another timeline. None of it makes sense. Two different stories. Okay, we had the press releases, then we have what was told to the family, because the fella in Oregon, the radar operator's brother, he received the same telegrams.
Right, there were the two
when I got
men.
him, I read them. He says, yeah, they just changed names. But anyways,
Yeah,
so now we have two different timelines that make no sense at all. Then when that was released in 2004 in my book, all of a sudden, a few months later, all the documents come out from the Air Force. Stan Friedman called me up and he says, Frank, the documents have been released. I'm like, really? Well, it's the aircraft accident report, and it was 68 pages long and heavily edited. And the preliminary report was missing.